I'm Chuck Bender, and welcome to No BS Woodworking. If you've followed me for a while, you might remember this tool cabinet that I made quite a few years ago. And I had built it so that it would house all of my hand tools. But, you know, like most woodworkers, I've continued to gather things. So if you look up top, you can see I've added a whole bunch of tools that are just piled up on top. And then if we come around this side over here, you can see that I've got a whole bunch of woodpeckers rules and T-squares that I just have leaning against the wall. And up here, again on top of the cabinet, you can see I've got some woodpecker squares. And then if I come around and I open it up and we take a look inside, you'll see that I've got some things just scattered about on the shelf in front of my planes and up where I keep my marking gauges and things like that. Lots of tools that just don't fit. And I even have a few things down in some of the drawers that are marking and measuring tools that just make it very cluttered inside the box. They're hard to get to when I want to use them, and it's definitely hard to clean the cabinet when dust settles in there and things like that. So I've decided I'm going to make a tool wall that goes along with my tool cabinet. I've got more of the spalted curly maple that I used for the body of my cabinet, plus a whole bunch of this English walnut that I've used to trim it out and make the door frames and things like that. And I've got this spectacular empty space just off to the side of my tool cabinet. So if you'll indulge me through this entire video, you'll see how I go through the process of designing and building a tool wall. Let's get started. The first thing I did was lay out all the tools on top of a couple of workbenches to give me a rough dimension for the size of my tool wall. Then I laid out and cut up the material for the panel. Did a little milling, rough cut everything to maximum width, and then I did a layout to get the figure to look just the way I wanted for that back panel. Remember, I'm using that spalted maple, so I wanted that spalting pattern to be just perfect. Next step was to set up the router table with a tongue and groove cutter specifically designed for thinner material. I set up the groove cutter, making sure that it's perfectly centered on my boards. Lock it in place and run the edges that need the grooves. Then I switched over to the tongue cutter got it perfectly set up to match the groove and ran the other two edges so I had perfectly mating tongue and groove joints. I then squared the end of each panel board, set a stop block on my sliding table saw, and cut them to final length. I then dry assembled the panel and took the dimensions in both directions, which gave me the length of the walnut frame. I milled some English walnut down to the proper thickness. After joining the edges, I ripped them to final width, squared one end, marked them and cut them to length, and then I was set for my joinery. I opted to use a box joint here. I mean, I could have used anything really, but what I liked about the box joint was it provides a massive amount of glue surface, which means that frame that's going to support not only the panel, but all of my tools is going to have maximum strength at the corners for when I hang this thing on the wall. So I cut the box joints at the table saw, and then headed over to the workbench because this isn't just your ordinary box joint. The show face, the part that you see when you look at the tool wall, looks like a mitered frame. So I start by laying out the miter on each end of the frame pieces. Then I headed over to the table saw and I set up the miter gauge at 45 degrees and used those layout lines in order to make the perfect cuts. The first cut I made, I had the depth set perfectly to 1 finger of my box joint. That way when I cut through, I'm not cutting into material that I'll need to make the joint strong. I cut all the miters in one direction, reversed the miter gauge, and cut all the miters in the other direction. Back to the bench, assemble the joint, and you'll notice that 1/2 still has part of the waste material in place. That's because I could only make the miter cut on there. So I assemble it, transfer the mark for the shoulder cut, clamp the piece in my vise, and with a handsaw, trim away that waste. Check the fit. Make any adjustments using a shoulder plane or a chisel. You could even use a rasp if you wanted. Double check my fit. Once I get it looking good, then it's time for the other 3 corners. Saw, saw, saw. Plane, plane, plane. Test, test, test. Once I've got the box joints looking good, I set my plunge router and route the groove into the walnut frame pieces for the tongue on the panel, which we haven't run yet. I made the groove in multiple passes using the stops on my plunge base. It's always easier on the router, the bit, the work, your nerves, everything if you do it in multiple passes because you don't overstress the wood or the router bit or the router motor. Then it was off to the table saw. I set up the fence and the stack dados so that I could cut the tongue on the end of each of the 3 panel boards and along the edge of the 2 outside panel boards.